So yes, there is somatic gene therapy and germline gene therapy. Somatic gene therapy is obviously useful for people who are already alive. However, we may not to be able to do everything that we can with germline therapy with somatic, at least in the short term. So we're picking up for where we just got cut out there. So David, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, as you know, transhumanists are very focused on the development of post-human superintelligence, and
Hmm.
there it is quite commonly assumed either a Kurzweilian scenario in which we will merge with our machines, or the Miri scenario in which quite likely a non-biological machine superintelligence, a singleton, will occur. Equally, the smarter our AI, the more that AI, if used as a tool, should facilitate our own genetic recoding. Organic robots too can edit their own genetic source code, a recursive process of self-improvement
Hmm.
too, and this can be radically accelerated in principle at any rate with the help of AI. Now, once
Hmm.
again, this speculative. I don't think this is going to be occurring in any serious fashion for another 2 or perhaps 3 decades, but it is on the horizon. Uh,
Wow. Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, we are using AI now for a huge amount of applications that people like Hubert Dreyfus were saying, "Oh no, that's not going to happen." But look, here we are, and we're using AI now. I think there's becoming more and more of a need for efficient, computable AI. We've got huge amounts of data to sift through. This whole big data thing, I think that's, although a lot of the approaches to solving big data problems is going to be narrow AI, I still feel as though it'll still help mine the problem space for the type of AI that might be able to to solve these sort of problems that you were just discussing.
Yes, perhaps there's one issue we haven't touched on yet. It's the nature of personal identity,
Hmm.
and the people who are keenest on radical anti-aging research tend to be those who have a very strong sense of an enduring metaphysical ego. At the opposite extreme are those people, and I confess I tend to be one of them, who very much in the spirit of Heraclitus, all is flux. There is a tremendous turnover of the physical constituents of body and brain. The information content clearly changes radically over time. And what is this particular entity that one is trying to preserve at all costs? And I think compared to true post-human life, even today's sublime peak experiences are going to be regarded as crashingly boring, mundane, almost trite almost, and the extent to which one will want to preserve Darwinian life is somewhat speculative. So in that sense, that might appear to be an argument against radical super. Oh dear, what's happened to the?
I can still hear you.
Okay, I've just my screen. I didn't touch it, so it's decided to
There it
auto
is.
power off.
Hmm.
So you'll need a fair bit of editing here.
That's all right.
Apologies about this.
That's right.
But essentially, I think it will prevent a vast amount of needless suffering if we can phase out senescence and aging, and yet at the same time not being personally a believer in an enduring metaphysical ego. It's not as though in the long run I think post-humans would want to preserve states of consciousness and creatures like us. It would seem extraordinarily cruel and unusual to do so. But given the amount of suffering, that anticipation of one's death, and this presupposes, I said, a conceptual framework of an enduring metaphysical ego, I nonetheless do heartily applaud the Google initiative. But I think there's no getting away, ultimately, for philosophical questions about the nature of personal identity. What is it precisely that people want to preserve? Is it ethical to do so?
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, well, there's a couple of things that sort of stood out there. Was one of them is trying to preserve the mind in its current form, and in order to remain quote unquote human, or whatever word they want to use to describe what's natural. And then there's the camp of, well, does it matter if we don't have a continuum at all? Can we just suddenly maybe make a copy, configure it, and then boot it up on a completely different server while the original is left to disintegrate? I mean, destructive uploading, for instance. What are your thoughts there? Do you think there needs to be some form of continuum maintained? Obviously, you don't believe that we need to, stay natural or whatnot, and that's not the ethical imperative.
Well, it's the nature of sleep. Curiously, very few people undergo a great deal of angst, worrying, well, within the next few minutes I'm going to be extinct. And that's because, in some sense, one believes that in 4, 8, or 12 hours' time, one is going to be booted up again. But what is the difference between weeks, months, years, centuries, or millennia? Personally, as I said, I think all here and nows are unique. They're strung together in particular sequences, thanks to natural selection, and this belief in an enduring metaphysical ego is genetically adaptive. But ultimately, it is an illusion, and certainly. If I were a post-human superintelligence, which admittedly rather stretches one's imagination a bit, and in the case of my matter and energy, is it ethical to retain it in its existing form or optimize it into some kind of post-human smart angel? I would optimize it into some post-human smart angel. It wouldn't be killing me in the sense, if one has this very strict notion of personal identity, there are simply sequences of here and nows strung together in particular ways, whereas people who believe in an enduring metaphysical ego would say, well, that's killing someone.
Yeah, wow. I guess it would be, but by your definition, an enduring metaphysical ego would be killed by going to sleep.
Yes, whereas I think most people would regard this as just a fanciful way of putting things, whereas I think if one is being metaphysically serious, this is the case. Having said that, on indirect utilitarian grounds, I think it is prudent to have a society which reveres the sanctity of life and enshrines it in law. What is popularly regarded as the utilitarian approach to ethics and life is not likely to have happy consequences. But that said, if one is speaking philosophically, I can't see in the long run we want to retain Darwinian life indefinitely.
Sure. So this may come as a bit of a shock to some of the people listening, and also people hearing this idea for the first time. It's been characterized that you or somebody who may have strong inclinations to phase out the suffering related to Darwinian conditions, you'd be happy to wipe out Darwinian life. Is that correct? Is that would you consider that as a fair characterization? Even if it was on another planet, right? Within the David light cone, all Darwinian life would cease to exist.
This is the idea that technology should allow us to phase out any form of experience below hedonic zero, i.e. experience that is neither subjectively good or bad in hedonic tone within our forward light cone. Is it ethical to preserve involuntary suffering? And I would say no. I'd stress the involuntary. I don't think anyone should need to worry that someone somewhere is going to force them to be happy. But in the case of the vast majority of organisms alive today, essentially, Darwinian life, involves a great deal of suffering, and it's going to become optional. And so, when one talks of indefinite lifespan, is one talking about the indefinite preservation of involuntary suffering, which is what retention of our existing biology entails.
That's interesting. However, if the processes of evolution didn't exist on this planet, we wouldn't have been here to talk about it. Do you think it's been a worthy outcome?
I personally think that the cost has been too high. Now, if one is in a good mood right now, perhaps everything seems worthwhile. After all, one is the culmination of evolution. But if one could see the amount of abject misery, suffering, despair, rape, murder, mayhem, starvation, parasitism, heartache, I could go on. But Darwinian life, it entails suffering on an almost imaginable scale, then I'm not convinced that it's worth it. But whether or not you agree with me, we're in the here and now. I don't think it is. These kind of speculations are particularly fruitful. Life will go on. The world does not belong to negative utilitarians and nihilists. And if one is ethically serious about phasing out suffering, I don't think one should be contemplating death and destruction. I think one should be working out how to phase out its biology, so that post-human life can be animated by gradients of intelligent bliss.
Right. Let's just say we found on another planet, like the beginnings of some evolutionary process, where organisms were complex enough to be able to, I guess, putatively, at least look like they can experience some form of like a qualia or some form of suffering, but also some form of bliss. And you saw on balance at that particular time. Actually, would it matter if there was a balance between bliss and suffering there? I mean, like, I don't know how you'd measure that, but let's just say you could. Would that matter to you?
Personally, if I saw the rudiments of let's say multicellular life, and the likelihood that, let's say, 500 million years of misery and suffering, punctuated, yes, by elements of happiness and bliss, but essentially a Darwinian cycle, I would want to intervene and ensure that life was was engineered so that it was purely blissful. I would regard any form of involuntary suffering as unethical. Because I think it's worth stressing that it's possible to favour phasing out involuntary suffering without being any kind of ethical utilitarian at all, whether you can be a ethical pluralist, virtue theorist, deontologist, even a Buddhist or something like that. The question is, should any sentient being be forced to suffer against their will? And okay, this for most of human history would be a purely idle question, but later this century and beyond, it is going to be technically optional.
Yeah, it's certainly a challenging position for a lot of people. I find. Look, it's hard to weigh these things up in our minds today if we don't have the technology which tells us we can do that. It's now, I guess, theoretically possible. I wonder if people's minds will change a lot when it becomes not just theoretically possible, but physically possible to do this.
Yes, once again, I think this is the case because although technically now it would be possible to phase out the biology of suffering, unlike aging, one could really phase out the biology of suffering, whether via wireheading or euphoriant opioids and so on. The pitfalls and manifold, and we don't yet know how to engineer gradients of intelligent bliss. Raw bliss even indefinite raw bliss isn't the challenge, whether it's electrodes in the reward centers or very crude long-acting euphoriants. But in terms of the whole project of civilization and ultimately, I believe, responsible stewardship of our Hubble volume, we don't yet actually have the technology to do this, but recognizable extensions of existing technologies do offer the opportunity. We already know in particular genes that predispose to having a very high hedonic set point. One knows genes that modulate the one's pain thresholds. These are technical challenges, the technical solutions.
That's interesting. So, well, I guess more specifically about aging, like the type of research that may be needed for solving the problems of aging seems to be more fundamental, and that's what Google seems to want to pursue within the next 20 years. However, and this may be also the case for trying to, I guess, increase hedonic set points, but it's possible that short-term technological spin-offs, when there's a lot of money and a lot of project managers trying to sort of justify their positions, getting involved, the short-term, easier to target technological spin-offs may actually be good in the short term, but could be a distraction if they are, if all the money or all the energy is converted into trying to achieve those sorts of goals, the short-term technological spin-offs I'm talking about, instead of trying to do the long-term fundamental research.
Yes, well, as we know, so far at least, Google has been extremely cagey about what precisely Calico will be doing. So there's not a great deal I have to add there, but presumably we'll know more within the next few months or years. I don't.
Yeah. Well, theoretically, if it were the case that they were going to try and achieve a long-term fundamental goals in research, do you think it would be a bad thing if they suddenly just shifted their goals to short-term technological spin-offs?
I think in practice, one of the significant aspects of Google's move is that I think it will open the floodgates. If Google is doing it, other serious players are likely to get involved in the market too. But okay, this is speculative, but I think this will be a significant factor.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I'm hoping that people don't stop donating to smaller research outfits like SENS and things as well. And it's not always, it's often the case that smaller research outfits do actually come up with some interesting breakthroughs.
Yes, very much so. I think what's going to be optimal is a diversity of strategies, both short-term, medium-term and long-term, completely speculative blue sky stuff together with more immediate practical, a multi-pronged approach. Sorry, that's in some ways it's a rather kind of shallow and superficial thing to say, but as I said, until we know more about precisely what Google Initiative involves, I think that's all we can do.
It's hard, yeah, it's hard to know, but yeah, I like speculating. Now, have you read much sci-fi, David? Is there any particular sci-fi that deals with some of the social problems and technological problems associated with lifespans and happiness, or having a happy old age that come to mind?
I read a lot of sci-fi when I was a teenager, and not subsequently. And I think one of the reasons is that so much sci-fi traditionally has a complete absence of sociological depth. And at that age, I was sufficiently immature to be able to appreciate it. And I loved Asimov's Foundation trilogy, for example. So much sci-fi, frankly, is just implausible in so many respects, and not just the stuff that has no regard for the laws of physics, but you'll find, well, I mean, like all the instances. With time I became more literal-minded and scientifically oriented, and the idea that 500 years' time we'll be speaking a recognizable approximation of English and be recognizably human and have still the same core emotions, still the same core conceptual scheme, and so on. Once again, it's just not going to be like that.
Okay, well, I think I've covered most of my little points on this Google Calico thing. I would like to note that there has been other attempts, initiatives. One of them was Larry Ellison's aging research, the Ellison Foundation. I'm assuming that Google's approach is going to be quite a bit different. I get the impression that Larry Ellison's approach was perhaps looking at sort of implementations to help mitigate the effects of aging, but not as much fundamental research. Do you know anything about that?
I'm afraid, once again, I'm just going to have to pass on this one.
Yeah.
Also, we don't yet know whether essentially radical anti-aging therapies are going to be 10, 20, 30 years away or later this century and beyond. That is a measure of our ignorance. Whereas in the case of phasing out suffering, one can definitely say, I think, that we understand in principle how it might be done. In the case of anti-aging, we are relying on currently unknown breakthroughs. That is the honest thing to say. Of course, saying something like that retards funding for radical anti-aging, because on the whole, most people are not interested in stuff that they don't think is going to benefit either themselves or their children. And if you say it could be 80, 90, 100 years away, they'll switch off for the most part.
And it's an unfortunate thing, and that's something that anti-aging could help solve. In any case, it's been great talking about this. I'll, I guess, end this particular part of the interview, and we'll talk about the next part. Thanks everybody for viewing. Hey, and David Pearce is coming to Australia, by the way, for all of those who didn't know, and he's coming to talk at the Science, Technology in the Future conference, and the dates are November 30th to December the 1st, 2013. Be there or be square.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm looking forward to my first visit to Australia and the koalas.
Yes, definitely. Okay.